You're listening to Big World Network.
Journey from Atremes, Episode 1, written by Riley Amos Westbrook and Sarah Lynn Westbrook, read by Wendy Herman. Earl stretched his arms towards the ceiling, then reached down to scratch at an itch between his toes. Rubbing at the sleep in his eyes, he stepped to his closet, wondering if he'd remember to turn on its wash cycle. He had, and the machine worked its miracles again. Yesterday he'd spilled a drink all over his favorite coat and feared it would be ruined. But this closet could clean anything. His vintage brown faux suede jacket was well worn, with patches in the elbows and scuffs on the wrist. He threw it onto his bed, pulling out other worn clothes and getting dressed for the day. A shirt with a hole in the chest needed another underneath it, so he felt covered. His pants had scuffs in the knees, but he made do with what he had. He grabbed a wide-brimmed hat after tightening the laces on his boots and stepped out of his room, headed for the kitchen. His mother sat at the table, staring into space, a vacant look in her eyes. She must have had a hard night. He kissed her on the cheek on his way to the coffee machine. "Morning, Mom. How was work last night?" He took a sip of his cup of stim, savoring the rich boldness as it flooded his tongue, while he settled into the other chair. Her eyes flicked over to him, then back to the wall. Still, she didn't speak. "Was it that bad last night? I thought you didn't mind working for Durtak. He may be all tentacles, but he usually pays well, doesn't he?" Earl downed the last of his morning brew and went to pour another cup, grabbing the toast that popped out of the toaster. He casually tossed a piece onto the plate in front of his mother, munching on the other as he settled back in his chair. Her eyes flicked to her son again and took on a pained cast. "I have to kick you out." "What? Why?" Earl asked, trying to keep control of his roller coaster emotions. "You haven't paid your half of the rent in months. Besides, Mr. Takar said I need another 400 latinum to cover the rent this month. Bastard is raising the price again. I offered to take it out with my services, but he refused. He said he liked young human girls, not old dried-up sluts. Damn bastard!" "That's a lie, Mom. I paid you on the first, the same as I always do. What'd you do to lose it this time?" She glared at her son in annoyance. "I didn't do anything to lose it." "Well, then maybe one of your customers took it." "It doesn't matter. I need you to pay or I need you to move out." She reached out a hand, taking Earl's cup from his and setting it on the table before clutching his empty hand. "I don't want to kick you out. You're my only child. But this was never meant to be our home. This is my office, my workplace, and if I lose it, I lose my ability to make a living. I can't risk that." Earl jerked his hand away, heading into his room and gathering up a bag of clothes in cold silence. His mother protested after him. "Don't be like this, Earl. You don't have to go right now. I can give you a day or 3 to find a place to live." He stared at a hole in the wall over his bed, collecting his thoughts. He thought of all the problems he had caused his mother over the years as a juvenile delinquent. She didn't even realize he had a steady job now, but it was one that depended on him having a home. It was hard to get by in this universe as a human. "It's all good, Mom," he said as he walked back into the kitchen. "You've given me a home for all these years, but I can't keep being a burden to you. I've clothed and fed myself for years while you struggled to get by. You never once thought of asking me for the latinum, did you, Mother?" Anger flashed in his eyes, and Earl needed a moment to collect himself before he continued. "It's okay. I've always made my way. You know that." "Then why didn't you pay your rent?" "I can't help if you lose your money. I know I've paid you, but it's just not worth the fight." He gathered his mother into a hug, holding her close before he left the room. He didn't bother with any of his other possessions. Everything he needed he carried in a pack on his back. He hoped his mother found the money he had left her before she moved someone into his room. Sound assaulted Earl as he stepped from the apartment building. The sun was shining in the sky, but the streets were empty of life. That didn't stop the noise carrying over the buildings that surrounded him. The low hum of grav-troll engines and the high whine of turbines were loud around him, followed by the echoing call of sirens. The alleyway he stood in was dirty, dark, and dingy. He couldn't help but double-check that the shadows really were empty. With some of the races that came to celebrate on this world, One never knew. Though they lived in the human district, Earl had only met a few of his own kind. There just weren't many pure-born humans left in the galaxy 1,000 years after the collapse of their empire. He stomped on a spider as wide as his palm, unable to resist the urge after spotting the disgusting creature crossing the road. If there was one constant in the universe, it was spiders. From giant sentient races that ruled entire systems to little tiny insect eaters that only thought for themselves. Even at the height of the human empire, spiders had been everywhere. Just down the road, Earl could see a body rotting in the shade. Flies buzzed around it, showing it had been there for days. He wondered for a second if he knew the dead soul. He shook his head as he walked the streets, wondering how a planet touted as a pleasure place could have so much death and decay in it. Earl had planned on going to work today, looking to relieve some of the pressure of life with his mother, but her kicking him out put a kink in those plans. Now he didn't know what to do, and spent the day drifting aimlessly until he needed to find a place to sleep. Once it was dark, he needed to get off the streets, or he could end up like the body from earlier. He tried the usual suspects, hoping his friends might keep him for a night or two, but found himself coming up unlucky. Either their parents didn't want to deal with Earl, or they themselves looked at him like he was a piece of trash. Earl couldn't help but wonder how he had fallen so far. Other races had always treated him with disdain, as if looking down on him, but now no one even wanted to associate themselves with his name, as if he had become some sort of leper. He had always been a bit independent, and was more than willing to go against the grain of society. People even claimed to support him in this endeavor. Now, though, when he needed the help, no one was around that could or would. He ended up spending the night freezing on park benches, hoping that the peacekeepers didn't find him and roust him from his post, and he needed to move twice to avoid roving bands of scavengers. He watched them catch some unlucky bum, and felt shame when he couldn't bring himself to come to the man's defense. Earl just didn't want to take the chance, not even sticking around to watch the unholy spectacle. When the sun came up the following morning, he found himself lined up outside of the Unified Defensive Coalition's Army, or UDCA building. Feeling the hole in his stomach and the coldness in his bones, he stepped into the warm embrace of the building. The air was sterile, smelling of disinfectants and cleanliness, unusual scents to Earl's nose. What looked like a giant pillbug sat behind a steel desk, its eyes solid black and filled with unfathomable depths. A computerized voice spoke from a speaker planted at the front of the steel desktop. "What do you want?" Earl was sure there were emotions behind the words the being asked, but the machine sucked it all away. Because of that, he knew this bug must be a hard-ass. "I want to join the United Defensive Army Corps, travel the galaxy, and protect the innocent." Earl sat in the chair across from the pillbug, putting his feet up on the cold steel. "You have schist on your shoe, and you mispronounced the name. It's the Unified Defensive Coalition's Army," the voice said, as the bug reached out and pushed his boots from the desktop. "I don't know why we let your kind into my army, but my commanding officers tell me I can't turn you away. You have 48 hours to change your mind, so go out, have fun on the town, and remind yourself why you don't belong in the UDCA. The bug dismissed Earl by returning to his work. "That's okay, I'll take my chances. It's that or spend the night freezing my chot off on a bench." Earl sat forward, leaning his elbows onto the desk. "So, where do I sign?" Earl spent the next few hours being poked and prodded, hopping from sterilized room to sterilized room, never getting a moment to himself. They finally dumped him in a room with a cot, leaving him locked in total darkness for what he assumed was the night. He was attacked in the darkness, not long after they locked him up, and he struggled against his assailant. He felt tentacles climbing over his skin, and felt his attacker trying to force the slimy things into his mouth. Earl finally managed to scare the creature away by slamming it bodily to the ground. The feel of the room changed when whoever or whatever it was disappeared. Silence descended, and Earl found himself fighting against his paranoia. He didn't sleep the rest of the night, and the man who came to gather him for the remainder of his tests didn't seem to care how tired Earl was. Another day of poking and prodding, probing questions that pushed the edges of his comfort zone. It went on and on until he was exhausted and ready to pass out. Food was brought for him, and he scarfed it down, leaving nothing behind on the tray, not even the bones of his chicken. After lunch, his testing continued, but with a full stomach, the tasks didn't seem so bad. He whizzed his way through them, only using half his attention on the problems and questions they asked. He spent the rest of the day suffering through the stabbing jabs of needles over and over. At the end of the day, he was dumped into darkness again. No one explained anything. No one told him what they were doing or the results of his test. They just continued to treat him like a piece of meat to be readied for market. Passed into hot boxes, passed through freezers, stripped and dipped, sprayed and deloused. Fingerprint, retinal scan, teeth imprint. They even did a brainwave scan. He found himself thrust into darkness again, wondering if there was a purpose to these tests, or if it was all just some cosmic-scaled joke. 3 more days passed in this way, and towards the end of the ordeal, Earl started to question his sanity. It was day 4 since Earl had joined the UDCA. His usual escort came to lead him from his room, and Earl found himself wondering when the testing would be over. The answer was today, apparently. He found himself locked in a room with other recruits. Earl surveyed the crowd, trying to get a feel for the people that surrounded him. 2 Antillans sat in a corner, mumbling to each other in hushed tones. Their light blue skin contrasted harshly with the dark, rich orange of the plebeians seated near them. Neither race had a nose, their only outward difference the color of their skin. An Anunnaki, one of the winged races of men, conferred with a Shalobian, one of the spider races, from the Tau Zeta cluster. Earl shuddered and searched the crowd, hoping to find at least one face there that would be friendly. Either he was ignored, or he felt the heated power of a glare when people did meet his gaze. Earl found an open seat as the pillbug that had signed him up took his place behind the podium. The same flat mechanical voice issued from the speaker at the front of it. "So you're the scum that made it through the process. Look around the room and kiss half of your number goodbye. They're going to die on the next leg of your journey. Survival training is rough, and so is war training. It's a dangerous universe out there, full of monsters looking to kill you. You're here to learn how to kill them. I'll count my blessings if 1 in 4 of you make it through basic." Earl and the other recruits were hustled from the room and led to a hover bus. They were told to keep quiet as they loaded onto the vehicle. One of the Antillans couldn't keep his mouth closed, and the sergeant in charge of them tore into him with a diatribe about his mother, father, and station in life. Earl didn't hear another word from anyone for the rest of the day. The ride through the countryside was uneventful and silent. Everyone seemed to learn from the poor Antillan's example. The sergeant that took charge of them was an Oogie, one of the ooze people of Otot. The tank that housed his body was attached to tracks, and gouges were carved into the earth as it made its way to where the buses were parked. Though they weren't particularly physical, preferring to solve problems using their intellect, Oogies were masters of tactics and training regimes. Their skills were unmatched when you wanted someone trained to follow orders. Paired with the latest in mechanized bodies, they made for some of the most formidable warriors in the universe. The recruits filed from the bus, forming a loose group around it while their instructor took them in. Earl could see the other recruit squads filing from other buses and being taken in hand by their own charges. The voice that issued from the Oogie's translator was vibrant and bright, as if their sergeant were full of cheer. "Oh, look at these useless bags of bones, coming to pollute my glorious army. Do any of you understand just how deep of schist you're standing in?" The Shalobian from Tau Zeta spoke up. "The ground is a little soft, but this mud isn't schist. If it were, it would be bad, but this is just wet dirt." Earl could tell the Oogie was mad, as it changed from a light green to a dark magenta color before speaking. "You stupid waste of chitin. If I had the maker's gift of a skeleton, hell, even an exoskeleton, I'd slap the stupid out of you. As it is, I'll just have to remember this in the morning. We're late now, so line up by height. Get a move on." The last part blasted from the speakers, and Earl had to resist the urge to cover his ears.
You're listening to Big World Network.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.